One of the biggest stars in television history used to crack jokes about his marriages and his divorces.
But the king of late night, Johnny Carson, never mentioned.
Johnny Carson was 79 years old when he passed away. An age most would agree marks a well-lived life. For millions of Americans, Johnny wasn't just a talk show host, he was a nightly ritual, a comforting presence in their living rooms, a man whose voice carried the country through turbulent times. For over 30 years, he made families laugh, forget their problems, and feel connected. At one point, he was the most famous man on television. But what millions never knew was this: the man who made America feel less alone, lived his final decades entirely alone. The Johnny Carson who existed behind the camera, the real Johnny, was a stranger even to the people who worked beside him for decades. When he died, he had no real close friends, no inner circle, and only a wife who lived a life parallel to his, not within his. How does a man so deeply loved by millions become a man who couldn't let anyone love him? How did the king of late night end up living a life that no one truly understood? To find the answers, we must return to where it all began, a small, quiet town in Nebraska, and a boy whose childhood pain shaped one of the most complex entertainers in American history. Johnny Carson, born John William Carson in Norfolk, Nebraska, did not have the warm, happy childhood many imagine of a future star. Johnny was an introverted bookworm, gentle, observant, and sensitive. But sensitivity is dangerous in a home where love is cold. His mother, Ruth Carson, was famously harsh, critical of everyone, impossible to please, emotionally distant to the point of cruelty. She had a way of looking at her children that made them feel like burdens rather than blessings. Even as an adult, Johnny once described her as the toughest woman I ever met. But privately, he used a different phrase. To his lawyer, he called her the Wicked Witch. All little Johnny ever wanted was approval, a smile, a kind word, a moment of affection. But Ruth's emotional ice never melted. She criticized his grades even when they were perfect. She dismissed his magic tricks. She nitpicked every achievement until it felt meaningless. His father, Homer, was kinder, but he was rarely home. His job required constant travel, leaving Johnny alone with the coldest part of his world, his mother. And so, Johnny learned the first rule of his life: do everything perfectly, and expect nothing in return. This rule shaped him, guided him, protected him, and eventually destroyed his ability to form true relationships. When Ruth died decades later, Johnny refused to attend her funeral. After a lifetime of emotional wounds, he didn't feel graveyard grief. He felt relief. But childhood wasn't all darkness. There was one thing that brought him joy, and it would change his life. Magic. Johnny discovered magic as a young boy, and it quickly became his escape. Magic did what his mother never did: it made people smile. It brought applause. For the first time in his young life, Johnny felt something he had never felt at home. Approval. He practiced relentlessly, spending hours perfecting sleight of hand, timing, and presentation. He performed at local events, family gatherings, and small community shows. And what he discovered was extraordinary. People loved him. His magic tricks thrilled audiences. His humor disarmed them. His personality, shy but sharp, captivated them. And most importantly, performing allowed him to keep people at a safe distance. He could make them happy without letting them in. He could be admired without being known. This combination, talent and emotional detachment, would become the foundation of his entire life. But then the world changed forever. War came. At 18, Johnny joined the U.S. Navy during World War II. Despite being surrounded by the chaos of wartime, Johnny became a source of entertainment for his fellow sailors. He cracked jokes, performed magic, and kept morale high. But there was something else happening inside him. Johnny kept everyone around him at arm's length. War taught him many things, but emotionally, he had already learned the lesson as a child: don't get too close. Don't rely on anyone. Don't expect anyone to care. He built emotional walls so strong that even decades later, millions of fans adored him, but almost no one truly knew him. When the war ended and Johnny returned home, he was a changed man, talented, witty, disciplined, and emotionally sealed shut. He enrolled in college to study radio and speech, sharpening the skills that would one day make him an icon. By the time he reached his 30s, he was ready for the stage that would define his legacy. In 1962, a 36-year-old Johnny Carson walked onto the set of The Tonight Show, and television history changed forever. America fell in love with him instantly. His timing was perfect. His wit was razor-sharp. His spontaneity was legendary. But what audiences loved most was something they couldn't describe. Johnny felt familiar, comforting, like a friend who visited your home every night. Behind that charm, however, was a man who carefully constructed every moment to feel effortless. One of his strictest rules was that he never met guests before the show. He didn't want rehearsed conversations. He wanted genuine reactions. He wanted authenticity, on camera, at least. Off camera, Johnny maintained the opposite. He kept his staff, guests, and colleagues emotionally distant. Even those who worked with him for 20 to 30 years admitted they never truly knew him. Ed McMahon, his loyal sidekick for decades, said, "Johnny could connect with millions, but struggled with just one." Another host, Dick Cavett, observed Johnny at social events. You could see him trying to appear friendly while desperately wanting to escape. This wasn't arrogance. It was emotional survival. But the emotional cost of his childhood would bleed into every relationship in his life, starting with his marriages. Johnny Carson was married 4 times. Every marriage ended in heartbreak. Every wife left with the same story. His first marriage to Jody Walcott lasted 15 years and produced 3 sons. But Johnny was never emotionally present. He provided financially, but emotionally, he stayed behind those cold childhood walls. Arguments, distance, and mutual affairs eventually shattered the marriage. His second wife, Joanne Copeland, understood the Hollywood life, but even she couldn't break through his emotional barriers. She famously said being married to Johnny was like living with a ghost. His third marriage, to Joanna Holland, lasted 10 years until she shocked him by handing him divorce papers on their 10th anniversary. The settlement cost Johnny over $20 million, the largest Hollywood divorce settlement of its time. His fourth and final marriage was to Alexis Moss, who stayed until the end. She didn't try to change him. She accepted his emotional limits. Her presence was quiet, distant, and uncomplicated, exactly the way Johnny preferred relationships to be. But the deepest wound of Johnny's life was not a failed marriage. It was something far worse. Johnny had 3 sons, but even they grew up at a distance from their father. They loved him respectfully, distantly, like a man difficult to approach. His youngest son, Richard "Rick" Carson, was a gentle soul, a nature photographer who found peace behind his camera lens. But behind the beauty he captured, Rick struggled with depression and substance abuse. Johnny tried to reach him, in his own limited way. But how does a man who never learned emotional closeness help his own son climb out of darkness? On June 21, 1991, Rick's car veered off a coastal highway and plunged 125 feet down an embankment. He died instantly. Johnny was shattered. Those who knew him said something inside him died that day. Doc Severinsen, Johnny's longtime bandleader, said, "The light in his eyes never returned after Rick died." Johnny took 4 weeks off from The Tonight Show, something unheard of for a man who had barely missed a show in 30 years. He did not attend his son's memorial service, not out of coldness, but to avoid a media circus. When he returned to TV, he honored Rick the only way he could, quietly, controlled, emotionally distant. He showed a sunset photograph Rick had taken and said only, "Rick was a good guy." People smiled when he was around. It was the closest he ever came to sharing his real heart with the world. After Rick's death, Johnny's isolation became absolute. But the final blow was yet to come, and it came from someone he trusted most. For years, Joan Rivers was Johnny Carson's protégé, his favorite guest host, the woman many believed would eventually take over The Tonight Show. Johnny discovered her, championed her, and gave her opportunities no one else would. But in 1986, Joan accepted an offer from Fox to host her own late-night show. She was terrified to tell Johnny, because she knew he would feel betrayed. And so, she didn't tell him. Johnny found out from the media. He never spoke to her again. Not a phone call. Not a letter. Not a word. For the rest of his life. To Johnny, trust was everything, not because he trusted easily, but because he trusted almost no one. This betrayal confirmed a belief he had held since childhood. Let people close, and they will hurt you. After this, Johnny began retreating from the world entirely. Johnny retired from The Tonight Show in 1992, ending a 30-year reign that changed television forever. Fans expected that retirement would bring a new chapter in his life, vacations, books, appearances, maybe even another TV project. Instead, Johnny disappeared. He stopped making public appearances. He stopped attending Hollywood events. He stopped granting interviews. He refused most visitors. He spent his days sailing, reading, and isolating himself in his Malibu home. People who had known him for decades said they never saw him again. Even close colleagues said they didn't have his phone number. He would occasionally send short handwritten notes to comedians he admired, like David Letterman or Dave Chappelle. But beyond that, he lived a life of silence. Johnny Carson, the man loved by millions, spent his final decade seeing almost no one. Johnny Carson died on January 23, 2005, from emphysema, after years of heavy smoking caught up with him. He died quietly, with no public fanfare, in the same isolation he had lived in for years. He lived alone. He died alone. And yet, he touched more lives than almost any entertainer in history. The tragedy of Johnny Carson is not that he was unloved. The tragedy is that he didn't know how to let love in. Johnny Carson's life leaves us with a haunting truth. A person can make millions laugh, and still battle loneliness in silence. A person can give the world joy, and never find joy for themselves. A person can be adored by a nation, and still feel abandoned by the people they needed most. Johnny Carson shaped comedy. He defined late-night television. He opened doors for countless entertainers. He made America smile for 30 years. But behind the applause, behind the fame, behind the legacy, was a man still trying to win the approval of a mother who never gave it. And in the end, the king of late night lived, and died, the way he lived his whole life. Performing for the world. Protecting himself from everyone. And hiding his true self in plain sight. While millions assumed Johnny spent his retirement relaxing in luxury, very few knew how he actually lived. Johnny's life outside television was astonishingly simple. He spent hours reading biographies, history, science, anything that stimulated his mind. He played tennis religiously, often alone or with a close instructor. He sailed his yacht along the California coast, enjoying the peace of the ocean. He wrote jokes privately, sometimes crafting monologues he would never perform. One of the most surprising revelations after his death was that Johnny still wrote monologue jokes even in retirement. He mailed them occasionally to David Letterman, without credit, without payment, without any need for recognition. It wasn't about fame anymore. For Johnny, comedy had always been a form of survival, not expression. Magic had saved him as a boy. Comedy had saved him as a man. And in the silence of retirement, writing jokes was a way of keeping a fading part of himself alive. Years after Johnny retired, many people wondered whether he and Joan Rivers ever reconciled. But the truth is painful. They never spoke again. Not once. Joan Rivers tried, multiple times, to reach out. She wrote letters. She left messages. She asked mutual friends to help reconnect. But Johnny refused every attempt. To him, betrayal was final, not because he was unforgiving, but because he was terrified of being hurt again. Joan later said in an interview, "Johnny was the greatest influence of my career, and the greatest heartbreak of my life." After Johnny's death, Joan claimed she cried not just for him, but for the friendship that had died decades earlier. It was a wound neither of them healed. Johnny Carson never publicly discussed his regrets. He had emotional truth behind humor, silence, and distance. But those close to him noticed something in his final years, a lingering sadness whenever his sons were mentioned. He regretted not being a present father. He regretted being emotionally distant. He regretted not helping Rick earlier. And he regretted the years lost to personal isolation. One close colleague once revealed that Johnny spoke quietly, almost to himself, saying, "I should have been closer to the boys, but I didn't know how." It wasn't an excuse. It was the raw truth of a man who spent his whole life performing, instead of living. His legacy was monumental. But his regrets were deeply human. As he grew older, Johnny slowly withdrew even further from the world. He stopped going to restaurants. Stopped walking on the beach. Stopped attending events. His Malibu mansion became a quiet fortress overlooking the ocean. Some neighbors say they saw him outside only a few times a year. Johnny spent hours sitting alone on his balcony, staring at the waves, the same waves he had sailed for decades. One neighbor, who occasionally caught a glimpse of him, described him as a man who had made peace with being alone, but never fully enjoyed it. Even in isolation, Johnny remained a figure of elegance, always composed, always polished. But behind that composure lived a loneliness that had shadowed him his entire life. Today, every late-night host, from Jimmy Fallon to Stephen Colbert to Jimmy Kimmel, owes part of their success to Johnny Carson. He didn't just host a show. He invented the blueprint. Monologues. Guest interviews. Sketches. Musical performances. Spontaneous comedy. Johnny perfected them all. When a comedian made Johnny laugh, their career exploded. When Johnny waved a guest over to the couch, it was a golden stamp of approval. He didn't just influence late-night TV, he defined it. David Letterman once said, Johnny wasn't just the king of late night. He was the entire court. His influence remains unmatched. After all the fame, awards, laughter, and applause, one question remains. Who was the real Johnny Carson? A comedic genius? A broken child seeking approval? A lonely man afraid of emotional intimacy? A legend shaped by pain? The truth is that Johnny Carson was all of these things. He was brilliant. He was damaged. He was adored. He was alone. Johnny Carson spent his entire life controlling what the world saw, the charm, the humor, the perfect timing. But deep beneath the surface lived a man who never truly escaped the coldness of his childhood. He hid his deepest wounds behind the warmest smile in America. And when the spotlight faded, he faded with it, quietly, gracefully, invisibly. Johnny Carson left no memoir. No emotional interviews. No confessions. No documentaries filmed during his life. The man who spent 30 years speaking to America left almost nothing about himself behind. But maybe that was intentional. Maybe Johnny believed that the laughter he gave the world was enough. Maybe he wanted his legacy to live in the moments where America forgot its pain because he made them laugh. Perhaps he knew that his own story was too complicated, too painful, too private to share. His legacy wasn't written in ink. It was written in laughter. And laughter lasts forever. Johnny Carson belonged to America every night. But privately, he belonged to no one. He was the man who made millions feel seen, while he himself felt unseen. He was the man who made millions feel connected, while he pushed away the people closest to him. He was the man who brought joy to the world, while battling loneliness in silence. Johnny Carson was a contradiction, brilliant but broken, loved but lonely, present but distant. And that is why his story is so powerful. Because it reminds us that even the brightest stars can carry the darkest shadows. Even in his final years, Johnny Carson often reflected on the paradox of his life. Millions loved him, yet he had never mastered the art of being loved. He would sit alone in his Malibu home, staring out at the ocean, and think about the choices he made, the walls he built, the relationships he never allowed himself to nurture. Friends and colleagues who caught glimpses of these rare, Private Moments said Johnny seemed contemplative, almost haunted.